After months of tension on the Korean Peninsula, Kim Jong Un suddenly offered an olive branch to the US, declaring that the DPRK would freeze all missile tests and that it wanted to solve the crisis with face-to-face talks with President Trump. What are the reasons behind this striking change? President Trump accepted the invitation very quickly after being briefed by the special envoy of the ROK who took part in a meeting in Pyongyang. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was in Africa and wasn't consulted. Later, Trump told supporters at a rally that he might lead the talks if no progress on nuclear disarmament could be made. What are the factors that could impede or prevent the meeting? South Korea said it has not received any further information from the DPRK, and in the US, some observers warned that if the top leaders couldn't make a deal, there would be no room left for negotiation. But if the talks actually happen in May, what can we expect? President Xi Jinping talked with President Trump on March 9th, and the two leaders welcomed the prospect of dialogue between the US and the DPRK, and both committed to maintaining pressure and sanctions until the DPRK implements denuclearization. What is China's role in this dialogue, and what measures should China take to promote the peace talks?
We can take a tea break from the agenda of Liang Hui and look at the Korean Peninsula. With an announcement that surprised many, U.S. President Donald Trump has agreed to meet with the DPRK leader Kim Jong Un. Observers are hoping it will lead to a breakthrough in the nuclear standoff on the Korean Peninsula, though some are saying it's already a triumph for the young leader, Kim. So, will the talks actually take place? What will each side try to gain, and what do they have to lose? And what is the potential for a positive outcome? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Zhao Tong, a fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. We shall also speak via satellite to Professor Dennis Wilder of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, the DC. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Gentlemen, are you hopeful that this summit meeting will soon take place as scheduled by leaders on both sides across the aisle, Mr. Kim Jong Un and President Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's more likely than not. Trump has openly committed to this. If he backsteps, he would...
The issue is whether he is able to bypass the establishment and even some of the closest advisors, such as Rex Tillerson, who was not in the White House when the delegation from the ROK came and briefed President Trump about the development.
Well, my personal view is the establishment is not necessarily that against this decision. He did consult with McMaster, the National Security Advisor. He even called Tillerson that morning and told him, because the Americans, they knew Kim would someday offer this invitation to meet. But it's just, you know, and most White House senior officials knew that Trump might want it to meet sometime, early or sooner or later. What surprised them is Trump made the decision on the spot, and to have these meetings to take place so soon, in about 2 months. But I think in general they are still supportive of his decision, and Trump has surrounded himself with people that will always try to explain Trump's impulsive decisions, like the spokesperson of the White House. They are already starting to explain to the American people why this is a good decision. So I don't think he's meeting such strong opposition.
I think there's a wide range of support in the United States, other than the extremes of the left and the right, the left saying anything Trump does is bad, and the right saying we should move toward a military confrontation and we should never even talk to them. And I think what Donald Trump did is what most Americans would like, which is to keep hope alive, to have talks, to see if talks make any difference.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Professor Dennis Wilder, who's standing by in the D.C., who is a senior fellow with the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Hi.
Good evening.
Hi. I'm wondering, what is at the back of President Trump's mind? Yeah. Do you think President Donald Trump wants to be yet another Richard Nixon who helped open the door for the U.S.-China relationship in the early 1970s, or he wants to be the laureate of Nobel Peace Prize? He wants to give peace a chance. So how do you read the mind of this president who is seriously criticized by his critics for many, many issues at this moment? Or he wants to really to divert attention from domestic bipartisan wrangling? What are your thoughts?
I worked at the White House for several U.S. presidents, and I can tell you that presidents like to be bold. Presidents like to take gambles. After all, Trump gambled on becoming president of the United States when he ran for office, and nobody thought he could do that. And win, that is. I think that he does see himself perhaps as a Reagan with Gorbachev at Reykjavik, or as Nixon going to China. Remember, in both of those cases, people said there was no hope. People said to Nixon that he shouldn't go to China because he shouldn't give Mao that kind of status. We're hearing the same kinds of complaints from people, but in my view, this is a bold and very, very positive decision.
Well, some of the Chinese say, hey, winning the presidency is the success of American democracy, despite the disillusionment and disappointment of the establishment and elites who criticize your president so much. That's not the issue we're going to discuss tonight. Zhao Tong, let's look at the location. Should this summit take place in less than 2 months, where is it likely to take place?
Well, the first question, I think the White House officials and staffs will definitely love much more time to work on the details, to prepare for all possible scenarios.
You failed to give us a direct answer about the location. You would rather think more about preconditions to be attached to the summit meeting, right?
Well, I'm trying to answer the first part question, which is when.
When?
I think there is a positive element of having this meeting sooner rather than later. Without having those senior staffs working out those details. It's better, I think, in some sense, to give the two presidents a chance to directly bargain with each other. But in terms of location, people, it's already like, bidding for Olympics. Several countries have proposed hosting this meeting. I think Beijing would love to do this. Beijing has made major efforts to help bring such progress today. Other countries, Russia, Sweden, Switzerland, but I think it's possible somewhere in South Korea is likely, if not Panmunjom in the Peace Village, but the Jeju Island could be a rather neutral place.
I'm surprised and even a little bit embarrassed that no revelation so far about whether China is willing to play host. I guess the United States, South Korea, and DPRK, none of them would give a serious thought to Beijing because we joined the economic sanctions. There's a little, sorry for saying this, but Mr. Kim Jong Un, known for his unpredictability, would rather maybe choose Panmunjom as the location. What do you think of the possibility?
I think it has to be a neutral location, and if you consider that the United Nations adopted the sanctions, that there are not many neutral locations if you would eliminate every country that voted for the sanctions. I do think the idea of Panmunjom would be a very good idea because it's neutral ground and it gives some standing to South Korea in it too. And I also think that both President Trump and other countries wouldn't want to embarrass anyone by saying, well, we considered Beijing and we considered Stockholm and we ended up choosing this. That's too much of a reality TV show, and this is more serious than reality TV.
Well, one step away from our central theme about the summit talk itself, Dennis, these two leaders, Mr. Kim Jong Un and President Donald Trump, traded insults and accusations a couple of months back, with Donald Trump calling him a little rocket man, citing fire and fury to punish someone who tested successfully the intercontinental ballistic missiles. How could this happen overnight? I mean, everybody is left wondering aloud why this happened.
Oh, I agree. I think, though, that we know the reasons why this happened. First of all, the maximum pressure campaign, which China was very instrumental in moving forward in the last 6 months, is starting to bite on the North Korean economy. And I think Kim Jong Un knows that he's going to be out of foreign exchange reserves by the end of this year. Now, he wants to survive as a leader of his country. He wants his dynasty to survive. He has got to find a way to get those sanctions lifted. And so one of the interesting things is how quickly he wanted both the South Korean summit and the American summit. And I think the reasons for this are that he feels the pressure. I also think that he thinks he's put himself in a good position by doing the missile testing that he's done. He can say that he's almost there, so he goes to the table with a card in his pocket. But we go to the table with a card in our pocket as well.
By agreeing very quickly to have a summit with his North Korean counterpart, do you think President Trump stands a good chance of winning the Nobel Peace Prize? Something that Obama won, surprisingly, despite the fallacy that the world could be nuclear-free. I mean, this is just a dream that would never be achieved. But it doesn't matter. President Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think this is something that is desired by President Trump?
Oh, I'm sure that President Trump would not refuse the Nobel Peace Prize if he could win it. And frankly, if he's able to pull this off, because it's a big gamble right now, but if he's able to find a way to get the North Koreans to denuclearize, to get rid of their missiles, I think he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. I think this is going to be a long, though, and hard negotiation. Remember, the initial part is just talks. The initial part of this is for Donald Trump to take the measure of the North Korean leader and see if he's sincere. Then we move to the hard part of real negotiations.
All politics are local. This happens. I mean, the invitation that he agreed to happened before
Sure.
the midterm elections. I mean, I'm talking to the two guest speakers in the Beijing studio. Rick, is this just a show, theater? No one is very serious about this. Kim Jong Un wants to ensure he will be the leader of the government. He wants to ensure the survival of a government that is struggling with the exhaustion of the forex reserve. What do you make of the political aspects?
Well, I don't think it's theater. I don't think that the stakes are too high for both of them for them to be engaging in political theater right now. Now, I mean, having covered American politics for 30 years, I will say there would be political benefit if this works for Donald Trump, just like Richard Nixon. It was 1972, early in that re-election year, that Richard Nixon came to China, and it really changed the dynamic of that race. But there's a lot at risk. I don't think that Donald Trump can calculate this in a political way. I think that he has to calculate it. If he does calculation instead of just deciding in the morning what he thinks, if he's calculating it all, it has to be on how we get from here to there, where we are today, to denuclearization or to some agreement. He has to. This is the man who wrote The Art of the Deal. He has to come out of this with a deal, or it will be a defeat.
What President Trump does is to silence the critics at home. And therefore, do you think he has had the moral high ground by agreeing to have a summit with Kim Jong Un without giving much thought to the preconditions? That takes us back to what happened in the immediate aftermath of the 8-year war against Japanese aggression, when Chairman Mao Zedong went to Chongqing for the 1945 peace negotiations with the Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the KMT government. By doing that, Mr. Chairman Mao said, well, I gave him the reason. I gave peace a chance. Now, if the civil war were to break out, it's not my fault. It's your mistake. And therefore, do you think we see repeat of history in this case about the possible summit between President Donald Trump and Mr. Kim Jong Un? Donald Trump really wants to have the moral high ground. I have ordered the military maneuvers, war game, on the doorsteps of the Korean Peninsula. I have also given peace a chance. Whatever the results, look, that shows the sincerity of my presidency. Do you think we can have this comparison?
I think Trump has some moral high ground. His decision is courageous and applaudable to some extent because he has tried everything else. He has threatened militarily against North Korea. He has tried maximum pressure campaigns through comprehensive political isolation and economic sanctions. And now North Korea, after the serious pressure, is willing to make concessions. And you have to be able to take yes for an answer. I think it's courageous that Trump now is willing to take advantage of the North Korean concessions. And another thing is, even if no concrete results can happen after the summit meeting, the U.S. will still achieve something meaningful. It can still use this dialogue process to delay North Korea's nuclear and missile development. And also,
every side is buying time. Each side is buying
But
time.
North Korea promised, as long as the dialogue continues, no more ICBM no more missile and nuclear tests. So it delays its progress. And also, Trump understands very well that for countries like North Korea, it's the top leader that makes the decision. If you want to have a chance of major concessions, you have to talk with the top leader directly. So I think that's a very courageous decision.
And let's look at the context of 6+1 denuclearization regarding Iran. Well, politics is about art of making compromise. What President Obama said in an exclusive interview, and I believe it's the first one with an Arab television channel, he said we need to have a country that unclenches the fist, right? So in this case, President Trump may keep in his mind the scenario about Obama in his interview with the Arabic television channel. Do you think you should first of all encourage the government of the DPRK to feel disarmed, not to be so defiant? I mean, defiance means zero preconditions, zero possibility for any peaceful talks.
I think right now you need to have talks without further preconditions, and I think you need to build at least a level of trust that the two sides can sit down and talk. I think it would be a big mistake for both countries, for both leaders, to start adding conditions. We will only talk if you do this. We will not talk to you. We will call it off if you do that. You mentioned Iran. I think Iran plays an important part in this way. President Trump has been criticizing President Obama's agreement to denuclearize Iran, the nuclear agreement. And Kim Jong Un knows that if there's an agreement that's signed with Donald Trump now, it has to be enforceable in the future. So he has to believe that American presidents will live by the word of previous presidents. So I think Donald Trump has to be very careful not to pull out of the Iran deal if he wants to get the trust of Kim Jong Un. The two are slightly related, and it's important.
Dennis, are you surprised about the current eerie silence of the DPRK about the immediate response from the White House? A spokesperson of the White House said, wait a minute, we need to have some specific conditions or preconditions before the summit is to take place. Do you think this has embarrassed decision makers of the DPRK? Therefore, we have this eerie silence.
Well, a couple of things. I've talked to people in the administration about this, and people have misunderstood what the White House spokeswoman was saying. She was not saying that there are new preconditions. She was talking about the conditions that Kim himself has offered, which is not to go ahead with any nuclear or missile testing and to come to the table willing to talk about denuclearization. We're not adding any conditions right now on the table. As to the question of whether or not, this can be done, of course it can be done. This is perfectly reasonable. Remember that Trump will be the first American other than a basketball player to meet Kim Jong Un. So a meeting without preconditions or additional preconditions is very important, because what we're trying to do is get a measure of a leader that we have never directly talked to in the United States. And that is a very, very important accomplishment.
Let's look at what China can do. After all, China was the architect of six-party talks. On the one hand, some of the Chinese observers complain that we may have been left marginalized because Mr. Kim Jong Un talked to President Trump instead of Mr. Xi Jinping. On the other hand, look, China has been supportive of very severe economic sanctions under the resolution of the UN Security Council. However, we didn't suspend the fuel supply. Now, if no deliverables or tangible outcome come out of this upcoming summit meeting between Trump and Mr. Kim Jong Un, and we are very clear that Mr. Kim has made some concessions. He agreed to suspend the nuclear and missile tests. He agreed to somehow suspend the development of the intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are tangible concessions. If the United States give no concessions, then China would say next time if we are urged to give more economic sanctions, China would say no. Mr. Kim has given peace a chance. You didn't. Of course, you participate in the summit meeting, but it doesn't mean you are part of the peace process. Who has made most of the concessions? Dennis, do you think China would say no next time to more economic sanctions?
I think if we misplay this, yes. But I would not suggest that we should ease up on the maximum pressure on North Korea yet. We really don't have anything on paper from the North Korean leader. As you have said, we haven't actually heard from him directly on this. The pressure of the sanctions has to be in place. Now, could there be goodwill gestures? For example, could the United States begin to think about having an interest section in Pyongyang and perhaps having a North Korean interest section in the United States? I think there are some early steps of goodwill of that sort that can be taken. But until there is something in writing and on paper, I think China, the United States, the United Nations, and the rest of the world must keep pressure on this man, because that's the only way to get him to follow through on these agreements.
President Trump did praise President Xi Jinping in his latest speech in Pennsylvania. He said, of course, China should have done more, according to the American expectations, but China has done enough to win respect from Donald Trump. Now, having said this, what do you think of the latest presidential tweet and even the phone call of the headline, a hotline between President Trump and President Xi Jinping discussing the issue of a summit meeting?
I think apparently President Xi sent a very clear signal, which is we understand that now the most relevant stakeholders are talking directly to each other. Even though China is not included in that direct negotiations dialogue, China is still very supportive. That shows, China truly believes in the dialogue for peace approach. Going forward, I think China already made it very clear. Without the UN Security Council making modifications to the existing sanction resolutions, China will continue implementing those. And as long as those are implemented, the pressure on North Korea will be increasingly unbearable. And that will play a very big role in keeping Kim at the negotiating table. Sometimes people make issue linkages between China's pressure on North Korea with the U.S.-China trade disputes, or even Taiwan straight in American policy on Taiwan. I don't think that is happening at this moment. The United States presidents used to threaten making that issue linkage, but it turns out that China has been very helpful, and the U.S. president, even after achieving this initial progress, still understands that it's critically important for China to keep implementing those sanctions. I don't see the U.S. can somehow play the North Korean game and no longer need Chinese help and therefore can maximum its pressure on the trade dispute. I think looking forward, the U.S.-China bilateral relationship is not negatively affected by North Korea, and is still moving very smoothly towards in the future.
What's the possibility for Mr. Kim Jong Un to fall on his knees? Because Dennis has said forex reserves are likely to be exhausted by the end of this year, and the United States urged China to maintain collectively maximum pressure to have further bite. What do you think of the desperation of a government whose leader cannot afford to lose the credibility in front of the people?
Well, I think Kim Jong Un does not want to let the world see him sweat. And I think he sees this as an opportunity in two ways. One is that he is seen for his people as a leader who brought America to the table, possibly the first time since the war in the 1950s. Secondly, this allows him to have some sort of leverage going ahead and postpone the sanctions that would, really biting, and to engage. Possibly, if Donald Trump breaks it off, it could break up the UN sanctions unanimity. So I think he sees the opportunity to ward off what would be a disaster. I don't think he can afford the embarrassment of the economy falling apart, and I think he's looking for ways to avoid it.
An ally of the United States, South Korea does have its own political agenda, Dennis. Yes, the current shuttle diplomacy by the RK delegation has shown every bit of honest sign to introduce a thaw and a rapprochement process. If this was to be denied vehemently by the White House despite the peace talks, then what do you think of the possibility, Dennis, that the industrial park in Kaohsiung would be reopened? Inter-Korean sentiments would be rekindled. There would be more family reunions. Such kind of a non-governmental diplomacy between the two Koreas will fuel the rapprochement to the dismay of the United States. And do you think President Moon Jae-in would say, hey, I have given you a chance, I've given peace a chance, I have taken care of the current economic sanctions, I've done every bit I could to introduce silver lining on the horizon, but you guys don't take care of our national interests, so we decided to go alone, we decided to go ahead. What do you think of the response from the White House in this case? Dennis.
Well, I think you've made a very astute comment here, and it's one that I want to reinforce. The North Koreans will attempt to divide us. They will attempt to divide South Korea from the United States. They will attempt to divide China from the United States and South Korea. We all have to stick together. And one of the things that the President did that I would note to you is he let the South Koreans do the announcement. He didn't make this announcement himself. The South Koreans came out on the White House lawn and actually announced what the President had decided. That was a very calculated move, I think, on the part of the President of the United States, and a good one, to show that he's sticking with our South Korean allies. We're not going to move away from them. And I think you are absolutely right. There would be tremendous danger if we let the North Koreans divide us and conquer.
Right. Let's give peace a chance. Let's give parties in the game some time to see whether this is going to work out. Therefore, President Trump may have won a seat in history for the maneuver and engineering the shuttle diplomacy. Possibly, he's going to meet with Kim Jong Un, the first in history. If you look at the process of denuclearization, let's give more patience. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.